A black domestic worker sues Millionaire who fired her, but in court, she reveals a secret that leaves everyone in shock. Maria slid the key into the massive Whitmore mansion door, feeling the cold metal in her fingers before turning it slowly. After years of entering in silence, crossing perfectly decorated halls and tending to every detail of the place, this routine was almost automatic. Still, after a lifetime of dedicated service, Maria felt a tightness in her stomach every time she stepped onto the polished marble floor of the grand entry hall. Her footsteps echoed in that vast and luxurious space where she spent entire days, though it never truly belonged to her. Each piece of furniture, painting, and decoration in Charles Whitmore's house demanded a care Maria knew well. She adjusted the heavy curtains, dusted the classical furniture, and gently wiped down shiny surfaces as if handling relics. The mansion, with its imposing architecture and calculated coldness, reflected the lifestyle of her employer, ordered, refined, and untouchable. Charles was rarely home, but Maria prepared every room as though he might arrive any moment. For her, his invisible presence still dominated the space. Maria moved through the expansive hallways and high-ceilinged rooms in a meticulous rhythm, tending to details Charles, always distant and aloof, would never notice. Her dedication, mistaken by others for mere perfectionism, held a deep, almost tragic feeling. Charles had no idea, but Maria's heart was in every corner of that house, each gesture a reflection of the unspoken love she harbored for him. This affection began when Charles was just an ambitious young man, and she was a girl filled with dreams. The master bedroom, it was there, between impeccably white sheets, that Charles slept each night, oblivious to the sacrifice she made. She would smooth each fold in the fabric with almost obsessive care, hoping her gestures would somehow make her love tangible. That room was sacred to her. Preparing it so Charles could relax felt like her mission, albeit a silent one. Moving down the corridor, Maria glanced at the golden frames along the walls, adorned with portraits of Charles's ancestors and other distinguished figures, while she remained nameless, invisible between those cold walls. Charles never showed interest in her story or her sacrifices. To him, she was just a discreet, replaceable employee. This thought filled her with a quiet sorrow, though she held on to the foolish hope that one day he might truly see her. In the kitchen, Maria worked with precision, preparing Charles's favorite dishes, each crafted with the knowledge of someone who understood his tastes better than he realized. She cooked as if it were a ritual, blending seasonings and ingredients with the care of someone nurturing a relationship that existed solely for her. Charles preferred elaborate dishes, and Maria strove to make each meal unforgettable, despite knowing he would never perceive the care behind each dish. To him, she was a shadow, a hand that served, never a person. Sometimes Charles would return home late, weighed down by business and commitments, while Maria watched from the sidelines, caught between devotion and suffering. He crossed the room with a distant gaze, without a word or gesture of recognition. She looked away, concealing her broken heart, unable to confront him or reveal the secret that consumed her. After finishing her work, Maria would sit on the edge of one of the grand armchairs, watching the mansion in its melancholic stillness, wondering if she'd ever find the courage to tell Charles the truth, to confess that her years of service were also years of sacrifice. She felt her heart bound to that place, just as her soul was tied to a life she would never truly own. One morning, as ordinary as any other, Maria was nearly finished with her morning routine, preparing the living room for her employer. She straightened a vase of flowers on the table, smoothed the curtain folds, and took one last look to ensure everything was perfect. This was the care she had always shown to the mansion, each gesture filled with a love she would never express in words. But that morning held a strange air, a tension she felt as soon as she saw Charles walk down the hall toward her. His steps were purposeful, his face expressionless, as if carrying the weight of a final decision. Maria straightened up, offering a timid smile, but Charles did not respond. His expression was cold, his eyes devoid of compassion or acknowledgement. "Maria," he said, his voice low but firm, "I need to speak with you in the office. Now." Before we continue with this emotional story, I'd like to ask you for a quick favor. Please subscribe to the channel and help me reach the 1,000 subscriber milestone. Now, let's continue. Maria nodded, her heart racing. There was something definitive in his tone, a sense of overwhelming finality that made her tremble inside. She followed Charles in silence, each step heightening her anxiety. They entered the office and Charles shut the door, signaling the seriousness and privacy of the matter. He looked at her with the detachment of a stranger. "Maria, after reviewing some things and considering my current needs, I've decided that I no longer require your services. Today will be your last day." For a moment, Charles's words didn't make sense to her. It felt like the ground had opened beneath her feet, and she couldn't breathe. Maria opened her mouth, but no words came. She simply looked at him, searching for any sign that he might be joking or that this was some sort of misunderstanding. "Mr. Charles, I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking from shock. "There's nothing to understand," he replied coldly. "It's a decision I've already made, and to be clear, your employment here ends today." The blow felt like a knife to her chest. Maria's knees weakened and she gripped the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. She looked at him, desperate, hoping he might show some compassion or at least explain. Her heart begged for a reason, something to help her understand. "Mr. Charles, please don't send me away. I have served this house for so many years. Her words struggled to emerge, each one a painful plea. She knew it wasn't just the job at stake. In that mansion lay her years of sacrifice, her silent devotion, the love he never knew but that kept her there day after day. "I no longer need your services, Maria. This isn't personal," he said, in a tone that cut off any hope of dialogue. "You need to understand and accept that." "Mr. Charles," she insisted, her voice breaking with pain. "Please, I don't know what I would do outside this place. This house is all I have. I've given my life here." "That's an exaggeration, Maria. Life goes on and people adapt. It's not my responsibility to handle that for you," he replied with a near cruel indifference. In the face of his cold reaction, Maria's despair became almost palpable. She couldn't accept being dismissed as if she were nothing, as if her years of dedication were insignificant. Tears filled her eyes, and she instinctively took his hand in an act of desperation. "Please, Mr. Charles, I'll do anything, work twice as hard, even take a pay cut. Just don't send me away, not now, not without even giving me a chance." He pulled his hand away with a quick, irritated gesture, offended by her daring to touch him. Charles looked at her, and in his eyes there was only the disdain of someone who no longer saw any worth in her presence. "I've made my decision," he said, with not a hint of emotion. "Don't make this harder than it already is. You need to go." The rejection on his face shattered what little hope remained in Maria's heart. She resisted the urge to plead further, but the pain was unbearable. He wasn't just taking away her job, he was stripping her life of meaning. Maria felt as though she was sinking into an emptiness, where all her dedication, all her years of work and unrequited love vanished without a trace. She stood in silence, her gaze downcast and her hands trembling. Finally, she took a deep breath and with a choked voice murmured, "Thank you, Mr. Charles, for all these years. I'll never forget what I've experienced here." He looked at her for a moment, then quickly looked away, impatient as if he didn't want to see her anymore. As she turned, Maria felt a devastating void, an emptiness that seemed to consume everything she was. She walked toward the exit, eyes glistening, trying to keep her dignity as memories and irreplaceable losses swirled through her mind. In the hallway, Maria paused in front of the large mirror near the entrance. She looked at her reflection, noticing for the first time how worn out she appeared. How many years had she spent here in silence, believing that her presence might someday mean something to Charles? It was as though all the time she had dedicated to him was swept away in a single moment, dismissed by a man who saw her as nothing more than a replaceable employee. As she gathered her few belongings and prepared to leave the house for good, she walked through each room, a final look filled with pain and farewell. She touched the backs of the chairs she had polished herself, felt the texture of the curtains she arranged daily, as if saying goodbye to a part of herself left behind there. In her mind, each piece of that place represented a part of the life she had sacrificed. Maria left the mansion with a broken heart, unable to understand how something so significant to her could be discarded with such indifference. At the gate, she looked one last time at the enormous house, where years of her life were trapped, invisible, worthless to the man she had secretly loved. That night, Maria sat in a simple chair in her modest living room, immersed in silence, while the events of the day played in her mind like scenes from a nightmare. Charles's words echoed in her head, a cruel sentence that wouldn't let her find peace. "I no longer need your services." The coldness with which he pronounced those words was engraved on her heart, and the indifferent expression he wore while dismissing her was a thorn she couldn't remove. Before her, on the table, lay an old, faded photograph she kept hidden among her few possessions. In the image, a younger, radiant Maria looked out with eyes full of hope and a love still innocent. Beside her was Charles, smiling in a way she hadn't seen in years. That moment captured in the photo was a distant memory, a dream that had dissolved, and the memory brought an overwhelming anguish. She felt as though her entire life had been built on that small spark of hope Charles had once given her, but that now seemed like a cruel mistake. She looked over at the small altar she had improvised in a corner of the room. Candles and sacred images adorned it, a place where Maria sought strength in her hardest times. Leaning over the altar, she closed her eyes and murmured a prayer, not for forgiveness or peace, but for courage. She needed the strength to do what she should have done long ago, face the truth she had hidden for years, and that could no longer remain hidden. Her eyes settled on an old notebook with yellowed pages, where she recorded memories and details of her life with Charles, and of a promise he once made. Though never spoken directly, that promise was implied in their shared glances and moments, from a time when there was still a chance for them to be more. Charles had, in their youth, implicitly promised her a life together, a family that never materialized. Now, recalling those memories, Maria felt not only the sting of being discarded, but a contained fury she never thought she possessed. It was a mix of anger and sadness, a bitter resentment at how he had not only ignored, but disrespected everything they had lived, every moment of sacrifice and devotion she had given unconditionally. The thought of suing Charles initially seemed absurd, something unthinkable for someone like her. He was powerful, surrounded by lawyers, while she was nothing more than a humble servant he had never truly seen. But the more she pondered, the more that decision solidified within her. Perhaps it was the burden of years carrying a secret that gnawed at her soul, or perhaps it was the fear that her entire life would be reduced to a disposable job. But above all, it was the certainty that Charles needed to know the truth, not just about the past, but about everything she had endured. He needs to know the truth, she murmured, almost as a promise to herself. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps at the living room entrance. It was Grace, her sister, entering silently, a concerned look on her face. Grace had always known about Maria's complex and painful relationship with Charles, and more than anyone, she understood the burden Maria had carried over the years. She approached, observing the suffering etched on Maria's face, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maria, are you all right?" Grace asked, her voice soft and filled with empathy. Maria looked at her sister, eyes wet, but there was no longer weakness in her expression. For the first time, Grace saw in Maria a glimmer of determination, a will that surpassed the pain. Maria took her sister's hand, holding it firmly, as if drawing the last drop of courage she needed. "Grace, I need to do something I should have done a long time ago," Maria said, her voice firm but marked by emotion. "I won't stay silent any longer. He needs to know everything." Grace looked at her silently, understanding the weight of her words. She knew Maria was not just speaking of seeking justice, but of revealing something that went far deeper than that. The story she had hidden, and the scars she bore on her heart as proof of a love that for her had never truly ended. "If that's what you feel, then do it," Grace replied, squeezing her hand firmly. "This is your chance to reclaim all that he took from you." Grace's supportive words brought Maria renewed strength. That night was long, filled with reflections and memories that she revisited with a mixture of pain and relief. But above all, she thought of how Charles had scorned her, reducing her life to a trivial service without ever recognizing how much of her was present in each act, each small gesture of care for his house, his tastes, his life. At dawn, Maria made her decision. She rose early, her stance carrying all the pain and courage she had accumulated, and began to organize her documents. She kept the small photograph of Charles, the only tangible reminder of the love that once existed between them. She took a folder where she had stored notes of her life at the Whitmore home over the years, and in a final gesture left a farewell letter on her altar, as though finally letting go of a lifetime of silence. Maria knew that by suing Charles, she was confronting not only the man who scorned her, but also her entire story and her choices. She knew he would never understand, that his arrogance and pride would prevent him from seeing the depth of her pain and the reason for her actions. But at that moment, it no longer mattered what he thought or felt. She was seeking something beyond revenge. She sought redemption, dignity, and a truth that could no longer be contained. As she walked out of her home, her face marked by a sleepless night, she felt ready to face whatever was to come. There was no more fear or doubt. She carried within her the certainty that her story needed to be heard, and that finally, Charles Whitmore would know what she had endured for a love he had never deserved. The courtroom was packed that morning, a low hum filling the air as people settled into their seats. Maria's case, a simple domestic worker daring to sue the wealthy Charles Whitmore, had sparked unusual interest. From journalists discreetly jotting notes to former Whitmore employees, everyone there waited to witness the unlikely showdown. Among the crowd, Maria sat with a calm yet resolute expression, her poise not lost on the attentive eyes of those present. Charles entered shortly after, his imposing presence felt throughout the room. Dressed in a custom suit, impeccable as always, he carried himself with an air of confidence, a natural superiority that followed him wherever he went. But upon seeing Maria across the room, something in his face shifted briefly, as though an invisible tension struck him. He quickly regained his composure but no longer seemed as indifferent. After all, he had not expected to find Maria so determined, something even he couldn't ignore. Maria kept her gaze on Charles, showing no sign of fear or hesitation. This was the moment she had rehearsed countless times in her mind. All the sleepless nights, painful memories and sacrifices had prepared her for this moment, facing the man who had controlled her destiny for so long. Charles stared back, but her serene gaze unsettled him. He had expected her to be frail, perhaps intimidated by the courtroom and the situation, but she appeared stronger with each word, more self-assured than he'd ever known. As the lawyers settled in and the judge reviewed the initial case documents, a tense silence filled the room. Maria could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, yet she did not falter. On the contrary, this pressure only strengthened her resolve. She knew that to many, her presence in the courtroom seemed almost absurd, as though a mere domestic worker had no right to confront such a powerful man. But Maria would not be intimidated by conventions or prejudice. She was there to speak her truth, and nothing would stop her. The judge opened the proceedings, announcing the case in a formal and neutral tone. Charles's lawyer spoke first, approaching the judge with an air of unwavering confidence. The defense strategy was clear: to reduce Maria to a resentful employee, someone acting out of revenge with no valid reason to be there. While the lawyer spoke, describing Maria as someone with a difficult temperament and a disregard for the household hierarchy, she watched in silence, letting each word roll off her without breaking. Inside, Maria felt a mix of indignation and compassion for herself. The lawyer's disdainful words hurt her, but she refused to react. She knew he was trying to provoke her, to destabilize her, but her face remained impassive, her gaze steady and serene. Charles's lawyer shot her one last, challenging look, as if daring her to react, to lose her calm, but Maria stayed unshaken, her expression unyielding. Finally, Maria's lawyer spoke, making a point to emphasize the dedication and years of service she had given to the Whitmore household. He described her competence, her care, and the respect she had always shown for the property. Each sentence reminded the court that Maria was not just an employee. She was someone who had devoted her life to that house, and now she was only asking for the respect she had always deserved. Charles rolled his eyes, as if it was all a meaningless exaggeration, but Maria felt the impact of the words, as though someone was finally giving voice to her pain. When it was time for Maria to take the witness stand, the room fell silent. She walked slowly, each step filled with a gravity that resonated through the court. As she sat, she briefly glanced at the audience, her eyes meeting Grace's supportive gaze. Her sister's presence gave her strength, reminding her of everything she had endured to stand there. Charles's lawyer was the first to question her, approaching with a superior look and a mocking smile. He began his questions with calculated coldness, trying to lead her into contradictions, to undermine her credibility and make her seem unstable. He questioned trivial details of her work, small incidents over the years, trying to reduce Maria's story to a set of petty grievances. He wanted to portray her as just a frustrated former employee. "Mrs. Maria, you've dedicated so many years to the Whitmore household. Tell me, why did you decide to sue Mr. Charles only now?" he asked, with a tone of disdain suggesting opportunism. Maria took a deep breath, her trembling hands revealing her struggle to contain her anger. She looked at the lawyer and then at Charles, and with a firm voice replied, "Because I finally realized I couldn't bear this weight alone. This is not just about a job, sir. I gave everything I had to that house, but I was treated as though I were nothing." Her voice sounded louder than she'd expected, but she didn't hesitate. Charles shifted in his seat, uncomfortable but trying to hide his irritation. The room was dead silent, all eyes on Maria, sensing that her words held something much deeper, something that had not yet been revealed. Maria's lawyer encouraged her to talk more about her years of dedication, and each word she spoke carried a raw truth, filled with emotions long repressed. She spoke of how she cared for the mansion with love, prepared each detail to make Charles feel comfortable. She described the meticulous way she cleaned the office, her patience in cooking his favorite dishes, all without expecting anything in return, save for a minimum of recognition. When she recounted the last days, when Charles had dismissed her so coldly, without even offering an explanation, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Maria's emotions began to overflow, and she allowed her words to carry the truth of a lifetime. The audience felt the depth of her pain, and even the judge cast a sympathetic look her way. Charles, however, remained unmoved, his posture rigid, showing no sign of empathy. He seemed to ignore every word Maria said, as though it held no significance. But deep down he was disturbed. Maria's serene expression, her calm and determination were a mystery to him. Charles had expected her to break, had expected her to cave, to shrink in his presence. Instead, each word made her stronger, more resolute than ever. When the cross-examination ended, Maria returned to her seat. She felt the weight of her own words, but also a freedom she hadn't experienced in years. She knew the road ahead would be tough, but that first confrontation had strengthened her. For the first time, she realized that the truth she carried was more powerful than the fear Charles had always instilled in her. The tension in the courtroom was thicker than ever. The exchanged words from the initial confrontation between Maria and Charles still echoed in everyone's ears, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. It was as if each detail revealed left the audience hungrier to understand what truly drove this woman, who appeared so common yet carried such intense strength in her determination. And now, as the case progressed, the first layers of her story began to unravel. Maria's lawyer stood up calmly, each gesture calculated. He knew that the truth was Maria's greatest weapon, but he also knew that he would need to unearth deep secrets and sacrifices, something that until now only she and her sister Grace knew. The lawyer approached the witness stand where Maria was seated and cast a firm look in her direction, seeking her silent consent for what he was about to do. Maria nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes focused, but a slight tension in her posture betrayed the difficulty she felt in exposing such intimate details of her life. "Mrs. Maria," the lawyer began, his tone gentle yet firm, "could you tell us about the sacrifices you made over all these years to maintain your job in the Whitmore household?" The question hung in the air, and Maria, who had rehearsed her answer in her mind countless times, felt a tightness in her chest. She took a deep breath and looked at the judge, then at the audience, and finally at Charles, who observed her with a scornful expression. The words she was about to say were not easy, but she needed to speak them. "Sir," she began, her voice slightly choked, "I dedicated my life to that house. Every day for years I gave myself to the work, caring for every detail as if it were my own home. I gave up many things precious to anyone. I gave up my personal life, my family, all to serve him," she said, gesturing slightly toward Charles. The spectators in the courtroom began murmuring among themselves. Charles's lawyer tried to intervene, but was restrained by the judge, who allowed Maria to continue her account. She went on, her voice now stronger. "I had a son, a boy. My sister raised him because I had to work," she continued, as a single tear rolled down her face. "Every day I went to that mansion while my own family was put aside. I gave everything to a job he never even acknowledged." The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Many looked at Charles with expressions ranging from curiosity to outrage. Charles, however, kept his gaze fixed on Maria, his expression of contempt growing sharper. He crossed his arms as if bored by her story, as though all this emotion was nothing more than theatrical exaggeration. Maria's lawyer seized the opportunity to pose a direct question. "Mrs. Maria, what motivated you to stay in that job, even with all those sacrifices?" The courtroom was absolutely silent, everyone waiting for her answer. Maria hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the truth she still held within her. She looked down as if drawing strength to reveal what she truly felt. "Because I believed my dedication would be rewarded," she finally said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I believed that one day he might recognize what I was doing, that he might look at me and see something more, that he might understand how much I cared." The implication hung in the air, and everyone in the room understood that there was a bond, a devotion much greater than a simple job could explain. The audience's gaze shifted between Maria and Charles, who remained impassive, though a slight movement of discomfort was visible. Charles's lawyer, no longer able to contain himself, rose. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the case. Mrs. Maria is trying to use her personal choices to blame my client. The fact that she chose to sacrifice herself is not Mr. Whitmore's responsibility." The judge frowned, but he allowed Maria to continue, sensing that there was something deeper to be revealed. Maria's lawyer seized the opportunity to bring the focus back to the story. "Mrs. Maria," he pressed, now with greater intensity in his voice, "so that everyone can understand what really happened. Could you tell us how you were treated within the house?" Maria closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath before answering. Memories of her years of work flooded her mind, each harsh word, every gesture of indifference she had endured. "I was ignored," she said, her voice trembling. "He never cared about me. To him, I was just a convenient presence, someone who was there to serve him but didn't exist. I was invisible." Each word felt like a weight in the courtroom, a silent accusation of years of pain and disregard. Maria recalled all the times Charles had walked past her without a single glance, all the nights she prepared the house for him, hoping he would notice her care, but he never did, never acknowledged her. The audience sat motionless, and the tension grew. Maria continued, her voice now steadier, as if each sentence restored the dignity Charles had tried to strip away. "For years, I was treated like an object, someone he discarded without remorse. But I was there because I believed that he might notice. It wasn't just for the money," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I had hoped that my presence might have some value to him." The revelation implied hung in the air, leaving everyone increasingly intrigued. Charles's lawyer shot her a disdainful look, while Charles for the first time showed a hint of irritation, a slight tightening of his face that only Maria noticed. Maria's lawyer sensed he had touched on something vital. He knew that Maria's narrative was shattering Charles's facade of indifference, exposing her humanity and his arrogance. He then asked a final, significant question. "Mrs. Maria, if you had another chance, would you have done anything differently?" Maria looked at Charles, her eyes filled with sorrow. She knew the answer, but she didn't want to hand it over to the audience as an accusation. She took a deep breath and with a bitter smile replied, Perhaps I would have realized sooner that he would never care. I would have saved myself years of sacrifice. But deep down, I think I would have stayed because for me what I was doing was more than just work. It was a dream I allowed myself to live, a dream where one day he might see who I truly was." Maria's words echoed, and silence filled the courtroom. Charles appeared increasingly uncomfortable, and the audience was captivated by her painful honesty. They saw in her not just an ex-employee, but a woman who had devoted her life to an ideal, to a silent love that, until now, she had kept to herself. Charles's lawyer tried to regain control, but it was too late. Maria's story was already in everyone's hearts, her words taking root as a truth that could no longer be ignored. Grace took a deep breath before stepping onto the witness stand, feeling the weight of everything she was about to reveal. She knew Maria's pain like no one else, and she understood that for her sister, this case meant far more than a simple redress for years of work. Every step she took toward the court was a silent declaration of support, a sign that she was there to finally help Maria give voice to her years of sacrifice and silence. Looking at the judge and the audience, Grace kept her posture firm, though her heart raced and she felt a mix of nervousness and sadness as she prepared to unearth her sister's secrets before strangers. When Maria's lawyer asked the first question, Grace closed her eyes briefly as if seeking strength. When she opened them again, her gaze met Charles's indifferent stare. He seemed distant, as though the situation was just a temporary nuisance, something he would quickly deal with and then leave behind. But Grace knew that, for Maria, what was happening here was everything. Grace needed to reveal the truth, without yet exposing what Maria held so carefully. "Mrs. Grace, could you tell us about your sister's relationship with her work in the Whitmore household?" asked Maria's lawyer. Grace hesitated for a second. It was difficult to find words that would do justice to her sister's life. She knew Maria had dedicated herself like no one else, and had left more than just the simple effort of a job in that mansion. She had left her very soul, a sacrifice that few there could understand. "My sister, Maria, dedicated her entire life to that house and that man," Grace began, her voice choked but firm. "She wasn't just a servant. She lived to care for that place, sacrificing herself in ways only those who really know her could understand." The audience seemed to hold its breath, There was something deeper, more moving, that Grace's words tried to capture. She continued, her heart aching as she revealed the emptiness that filled Maria's life. Grace paused, looking directly at Charles with a restrained but accusatory stare. Maria gave up dreams, important moments, her own family. She did it all for an ideal no one here would understand. She lived with an emptiness, an absence that follows her every day. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and the mention of that emptiness prompted a murmur among the crowd. Everyone there was now more attentive, trying to understand what lay behind that life of sacrifice. Charles, however, kept his gaze steady, as if her words had no power over him. Yet Grace, who knew him well enough, noticed that his posture was starting to waver, though he hid it. Charles's lawyer, visibly unsettled, quickly rose, his voice harsh. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this seems like an unnecessary emotional appeal. Mrs. Maria chose to work in that house and no one forced her to make any sacrifices." Grace, her eyes fixed on Charles, felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. She knew how much this man had ignored Maria over the years, how much he had taken from her without ever caring. Grace took a deep breath before responding. Yes, it was her choice, but that choice was made by someone who believed in something he never valued, she said, her voice heavy with pain. "My sister expected that in time, he would recognize what she was doing, but that never happened." The murmurs in the audience grew, and many exchanged uncomfortable glances, as though the depth of Grace's words brought to light a truth difficult to face. Maria's lawyer then asked one last question, one that would leave the air even more charged, and that only Grace could answer. "Mrs. Grace, could you tell us why, in your opinion, your sister continued to work for Mr. Whitmore, even with all those sacrifices?" Grace hesitated. She felt Maria's gaze upon her, and she knew she couldn't reveal everything, not yet, but she needed to make it clear that there was something more, something Charles could never understand. "My sister believed that there was something special in that house. She nurtured a silent hope, one he never acknowledged," Grace answered, looking at Maria, her heart full of compassion. "But in a way, that kept her alive. Without realizing it, he was the reason she never gave up." The audience was silent. The intensity of Grace's words made everyone there realize that Maria's dedication went far beyond a simple job. It was a personal devotion, a silent love that, until now, she had kept to herself. When it was Maria's turn to speak, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She walked to the witness stand, her posture upright but her heart pounding. Maria knew that this was the moment to expose the secret she had kept for 2 decades, the secret that explained each choice, every sacrifice, and each night she allowed herself to live in the shadow of an illusion. She knew there would be no turning back after this. Maria looked around, summoning courage. Her eyes passed over the audience, stopping on Grace, and then turned to Charles, who watched her with a mix of indifference and irritation. Maria, however, did not look away. This was the man who had scorned her, but he was also the one with whom she shared the secret she was about to reveal. "Your Honor," Maria began, her voice trembling but resolute, "there is something I never shared with anyone except my sister, something I have kept hidden all these years." The tension in the courtroom grew. Charles frowned, clearly uncomfortable, and the audience leaned forward, eager to hear what she would say. Maria took a deep breath, and her voice, now stronger, broke the silence of the room. "Mr. Whitmore and I had a brief relationship in the past," she said, as shock spread among the attendees. "And from that relationship, a child was born." Her words fell like a bomb, leaving everyone stunned. Maria continued before anyone could react, trying to keep control of her emotions. "He never knew about this child. He never wanted to know. When I found out I was pregnant, I was rejected. Left to raise this child alone, but I couldn't. She paused, her voice choked. "I couldn't do that to him, so my sister raised him. She raised him as if he were her own, while I dedicated myself to the Whitmore house, to his father." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Charles sat pale, his hands clenched, unable to hide his shocked expression. Charles's lawyer looked at him uncertainly but dared not interrupt. Maria went on, each word laden with years of pain. "I stayed because I wanted him to know, to understand how much I sacrificed. I kept working in that house, even knowing I would never be acknowledged. I did it because I hoped that someday he would see what I meant, that he would recognize our son." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations of surprise. Journalists began furiously taking notes, and the audience fidgeted in their seats, absorbing the weight of the revelation. Charles was stunned, incapable of processing what he had just heard. For the first time, his mask of indifference completely fell, revealing the devastating impact of the truth Maria had just laid bare. Maria, on the other hand, felt a strange peace within. The truth, finally spoken, was painful but liberating. She looked at Charles one last time, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of everything she had endured, every sacrifice he had ignored, every hope she had held alone. This was the moment she had waited for her entire life, and now finally he knew. The impact of Maria's revelation still hung in the air like a wave that had just begun to hit everyone with full force. The people around seemed immobilized, as though each one was still processing the overwhelming truth that had been revealed. The courtroom, once buzzing with murmurs and exclamations, now became a sea of silence, broken only by the labored breaths of a few spectators, still incredulous at the secret exposed. Charles sat, appearing like a man whose world had collapsed, his face pale and eyes wide. It was as if Maria's words had stripped away the layer of arrogance he had always worn, and for an instant he seemed smaller, more vulnerable. Beside him, his lawyer tried to murmur words of reassurance, but Charles barely heard him. He was frozen, his gaze fixed on Maria, as if searching for any sign that it was all a lie. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something in Maria's expression, the repressed pain in her eyes, made it impossible to doubt her. After a few seconds of absolute silence, Charles finally rose, his voice trembling but filled with rage. This is slander," he exclaimed, trying to regain his composure, but his voice sounded more desperate than controlled. "She's making all of this up to hurt me. This is absurd." Maria watched him silently, her face serene, but her eyes reflected a deep weariness, as though this moment was the end of an exhausting journey. She knew Charles would try to deny it, knew he would not easily accept the truth. With an almost painful calm, she reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed envelope, a relic of the past that she had kept all these years. "Your Honor," Maria said, her voice low but firm, "I would like to present evidence to support my words." She opened the envelope with trembling hands and took out a faded letter, carefully written almost lovingly, along with an old photograph showing her and Charles, both young and smiling, immersed in a moment that seemed as distant as it was intangible. The image captured a time when possibilities still existed, before all the distance, bitterness, and disappointments. Maria held up the photo and letter, handing them to the judge, who examined them in silence before passing them to Charles's lawyer. The lawyer took the documents reluctantly, and as he examined them, his expression hardened. He tried to conceal his discomfort, but the gravity of the evidence was undeniable. The letter, written by Charles over 20 years ago, contained words of affection and promises that now felt like ghosts, remnants of a past Charles preferred to forget. But the proof was there, concrete, laid out for all to see. "This is a letter from Mr. Whitmore to me, written when we were both young," Maria said, her voice choked with emotion. "In this letter, he promised me things that never materialized. It's a reminder of a time when I still believed there could be something between us, when I believed he would accept me." The courtroom was plunged into a profound silence, as though each person was suspended in a moment of unbearable tension. Charles, upon hearing Maria's words and seeing the documents, tried to regain control, but his demeanor betrayed him. He was stunned, his gaze fixed on the documents, as though they could somehow deny the truth they carried. Slowly shaking his head in denial, he took a step toward the judge. This was a long time ago," he protested, his voice now carrying a desperation he tried to mask. "It doesn't mean that she's telling the truth about this supposed child." Maria held his gaze and then, with a voice barely a whisper yet filled with sorrow, she replied, "Deny it all you want, Charles, but you know it's true. You know that we have a son you rejected before he was even born." The courtroom, which had been restrained until then, erupted into murmurs and gasps of shock. The force of Maria's words was undeniable, and everyone there could feel the sincerity, the emotional weight they carried. Charles felt a mixture of humiliation and anger as he observed the crowd's reaction. In his mind, he replayed their brief past together, and a sense of shame began to emerge, something he struggled to suppress. At that moment, the judge, in a commanding gesture, called for silence, and the people immediately quieted, though their gazes remained fixed on Charles and Maria, eager for each detail of this unfolding story. Charles, his face pale and expression haunted, sat back down, unable to face Maria's gaze. Then, in an unexpected move, Maria's lawyer announced the presence of another witness, The audience exchanged confused glances as a new figure approached the witness stand, a young man tall with a serious expression and a look filled with disdain. He walked across the room with steady steps and unflinching eyes that never left Charles. When the young man reached the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. The judge asked him to identify himself, and he answered in a firm voice, "My name is Daniel, and I am Maria's son, and Charles Whitmore's." The revelation hit like a second bomb in the courtroom. The shock was now palpable, and Charles seemed petrified, staring at the young man as though seeing a ghost. He studied Daniel's face, searching for any familiar trace, something that would confirm or deny the truth. But the young man's cold, resentful gaze was unmistakable, a look of long-held anger and abandonment. Charles tried to rise but seemed paralyzed. It was as though the weight of years of denial and indifference had finally caught up with him, and he didn't know how to react. The young man looked down at him with an expression that combined contempt and pain, and his voice, when he spoke again, sounded like a blade. "All my life, I wondered who my father was. My mother never told me, but I knew he was out there somewhere. And now, after 20 years, I find out it's you, that my past was discarded by you as though I didn't matter." Daniel's words echoed through the courtroom, and Charles closed his eyes, feeling a pang of shame he had never known. He tried to defend himself, to say something, but no words came. Standing before him was his own son, a young man he had never known existed, but who now confronted him with a truth that was as painful as it was inescapable. Maria watched the scene with a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew this moment was necessary, but seeing her son exposed, bearing the pain she had tried so hard to protect him from, broke her heart. Yet it was too late to turn back. The truth had finally come out, and now they would have to deal with the consequences. The courtroom remained silent as the judge delivered the final decision. Each word carried the weight of Maria's years of sacrifice, her resilience, and her courage in facing not only Charles Whitmore, but also the past she had kept hidden. The judge announced Maria's victory in a firm voice, awarding her a significant settlement and retroactive support for the son Charles had neglected his entire life. Maria closed her eyes briefly, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't sought revenge, only the justice her life had always deserved. From that moment on, she knew everything would change. Charles, sitting in his chair, slowly absorbed the sentence. His once proud shoulders now slumped under the weight of the consequences. For a moment he cast a quick glance at Maria and his son, but Daniel's gaze remained cold, unyielding. Leaving the courthouse, Maria felt the weight of the years lift from her shoulders like mist dissipating at sunrise. Grace waited outside, her eyes shining with pride and tears. Daniel stood beside both women, observing his mother in silence, still processing everything that had happened and trying to come to terms with the new reality in which he finally knew his father's identity. With the settlement she received, Maria made a decision that would change everyone's future. In a quiet neighborhood, far from the impersonal luxury of the Whitmore mansion, she bought a cozy house. Modest but welcoming, it had a garden out front where she imagined planting flowers and creating memories with her family. Grace and Daniel helped arrange every detail in their new home, hanging pictures, setting up furniture, and gradually filling the space with laughter and stories. The house grew warm with love and unity Maria had never felt at the Whitmore mansion. There, in that home built with effort and dignity, Maria finally felt whole. For Maria, seeing Grace and Daniel live by her side was the fulfillment of a long-held dream. The sacrifices she had made, the years of absence from her son's life, all now seemed to have a purpose. The family she had always wished for was finally together. Maria felt at peace, with a calm she hadn't experienced in years. She spent her days tending to her home and the small details symbolizing everything she wanted to build with her son and sister. At every moment she could finally hug Daniel, knowing he was within reach with no more barriers between them. But despite everything, the past was not so easily forgotten. Charles Whitmore, shaken and humiliated, spent weeks trying to understand how to recover the lost time. The image he had built for himself was crumbling, and the reality of having a son he had never known, who now rejected him, weighed on him like a silent sentence. He knew that trying to reach out to Daniel would not be easy. Charles bore the guilt of a lifetime of selfish choices, of unfulfilled promises, and a love he had never known how to embrace. One morning, Charles gathered the courage and went to Maria's new house. From a distance, he watched her. She was in the garden, tending to flowers planted with Daniel and Grace. The scene stirred something in his heart. The simplicity of the moment touched him in a way he had never anticipated. For him, luxury had always been synonymous with achievement, but there was Maria, content with a modest life surrounded by those who truly loved her. Maria noticed Charles's presence and walked to the gate, her face calm, but without the affection she had once felt for him. Charles hesitated for a moment, but mustered the strength to approach, watching her with an expression that blended regret with an unspoken plea for understanding. The sun was setting as Maria and Charles sat down for a final conversation. She knew this meeting was necessary, not for him, but for herself. When she saw him approach, his posture was hesitant, tinged with a vulnerability he had never shown before. Charles sat down beside her on a wooden bench, and for a moment the silence spoke louder than any words could. "Maria, I know apologies won't erase what you went through, but I want you to know that I deeply regret it," Charles said, his voice heavy with emotion. Maria listened attentively, but showed no surprise. It was as though she was finally seeing the real Charles, without the masks of pride and coldness he had worn for years. Her tone was soft yet firm as she replied, "Charles, I loved you with everything I had. I believed in something that now I see could never have existed. That love was a part of me, a part that taught me, shaped me, but that I had to let go of." Charles lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time, he understood the depth of Maria's feelings, and simultaneously, the truth that that love had been buried. She continued, gazing at the sky with an expression of peace. "What I wanted, Charles, wasn't your love. It was respect, recognition for what I did, the value of my presence. I needed you to understand that all those years, while you saw me only as an employee, I saw myself as a whole woman, deserving of something better." He nodded, the pain and remorse clear on his face. "I know I failed you, Maria, and for that I'm sorry. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I understand what you sacrificed." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I was blind to the life I thought I needed to live, and I ignored what really mattered." She looked at him with a compassionate but firm expression, and with a faint smile she responded, "You chose the path you thought would bring you happiness. I did the same. And in the end, I found something better than the love I once had for you. I found peace." The two sat there in silence, as though saying goodbye to an important chapter in their lives. After a few minutes, Charles stood up, exchanging a final look of respect with Maria before leaving. He knew this was the end of a cycle, but the beginning of something he still didn't fully understand. Back at the mansion, Charles felt the emptiness around him. Each room, each meticulously arranged piece of furniture, now seemed lifeless. He walked the corridors where Maria had spent years caring for every detail, as if it were her mission, and the emptiness of the house mirrored the void he now carried. For the first time he realized that Maria's true home was now elsewhere, a home she had built with love and dignity, while he remained surrounded by the silence of meaningless luxury. The next day, Charles received a short message on his phone. It was from Daniel. With few words but filled with meaning, the message read, "Thank you for acknowledging what my mother went through. Maybe in time, we can talk more." Charles felt a mix of surprise and hope. It was a small gesture, but enough to nourish the possibility that someday he and his son might truly connect. Meanwhile, Maria was at home, sitting in the garden, watching Grace and Daniel as they worked together, planting new flowers. The scene was simple, yet filled with meaning for her. There, among the blossoming plants, she saw the reflection of her journey, a life that was growing and renewing itself. With a slight smile, Maria let her thoughts drift to a final reflection. The truth had been liberating. She had faced her ghosts and rediscovered her strength. She knew the love and hope she had carried for years toward Charles had been real, but she also understood that they didn't define who she was. She was much more than that. A complete woman, a devoted mother, and a loyal sister. Watching her son smile and her sister by her side, she felt that peace was finally hers. She looked at the garden, envisioning the flowers she would plant in the coming months, seeing in them the future she had built with her own courage. Amid the greenery and colors, she felt her new home mirrored the life she had always desired. And now, after so much suffering and overcoming, it was blossoming for her. As they dug the soil, they heard footsteps at the entrance. It was Charles, holding a delicate sapling wrapped in simple paper. He approached with a timid smile and extended the gift to Maria. "I thought maybe you could plant this tree here," he said, his voice filled with humility. I know I was never there for you before, but I'd like for it to grow alongside everything you're building now." Maria looked at him surprised and saw sincerity in his eyes. She nodded, accepting the gesture. Charles knelt beside Daniel, and together they began digging the soil to plant the tree. In silence, the three worked side by side, their hands mingling with the earth, their breathing in rhythm. When they finished, Charles stepped back, observing the tree now rooted there, intertwined with Maria and Daniel's new future. He left with a discreet wave, but the symbol of his redemption remained. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Don't miss the video now appearing on the screen. Click to keep enjoying stories that will move you.